We came legally and paid our dues and with no handouts, and I'm not even going to read the rest because it's not worth my time. I do want to, however, debunk those three statements because that is the most irritating thing I hear from Italian Americans. Regardless of whether your own relatives went to the US legally from Italy or not, it doesn't negate the fact that during the biggest wave of migration from Italy to the US, there were no laws in place. There were no immigration laws in place barring them from coming over. So already from that fact, your first statement doesn't make sense. Number two, there was literally a derogatory term created for Italians because we were notorious for not having papers. Did you never hear that before? Of the many vile things that they called Italians in the United States, WAP was one of the more popular ones. And just last thing about that first point, I know so many Italians who arrived in the US, overstayed their visas, and they just got away with it. Okay, no one was checking up on them. No one was, verifying what date they came, why they didn't go back to Italy when they were supposed to. And if we really want to talk about legal and illegal activities, I don't know if you know this, but Italians literally brought the mafia. I think Italians need to sit this one out. Paid our dues. I don't know what you mean by that. Do you mean by getting discriminated against? Do you mean being chased down in places like New Orleans? Do you mean being exploited? Do you mean working in such awful, poor conditions? Do you mean not being allowed to sit in certain places and interact with the WASPs? That's not something to be proud of, babe. And again, the mafia operated and still operates heavily in Italian American communities. So yeah, I guess we did pay our dues. And this third and last point is always the one that gets me, with no handouts. I don't know who you know. I don't know your family history, but if you just look at Italian history in places like New York City, there were plenty of mutual aid societies. Okay, there were plenty of institutions and organizations, the Italian Welfare League, that literally assisted poor Italians. Also, if an Italian ever went to the bank, or an Italian American ever went to the bank to ask for a loan, is that not a handout? If an Italian or an Italian American ever lived in the projects, which, trust me, in New York City in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they did, is that not a handout? Is that not a government handout? I mean, subsidized housing. So please, Josie, I know this is not the first time that you've commented something like this on my profile and won't be the last, but please use your brain, use your head, and read up on the actual Italian history in the US, not just the revisionist kind where we pulled ourselves by our bootstraps and we went to work and we didn't complain and we didn't have handouts and we didn't do... Girl, read a fucking book. Bye. There were no immigration laws in place barring them from coming over.
Go check out that creator. Her videos on the Italian American experience are really fascinating, and she's completely correct. I had to write a paper for one of my classes, and the statistics I found were shocking. Basically, the Italian American middle class in this country, the homeowners, the college grads, etc., all these statistics were built by the GI Bill and by the New Deal. They were completely government subsidized from the ground up. And without that, there would be no Italian middle class in this country. So it's just, once that changed, and they're not the only ethnic whites who benefited from this by far, but once that changed and government started doing affirmative action, everything changed, right? These people didn't want that anymore. The deindustrialization, which was the fault of the higher ups in capital, they blamed busing, they blamed women's liberation, they blamed gay rights, etc., and not the real causes.
Italian Americans love to talk about how we were discriminated against in the US, how we faced a lot of bigotry, how we faced a lot of hurdles, how we had to assimilate and abandon our roots, our Italian language, or rather Italian, because the Italian immigrants who arrived in the US during that time did not speak Italian. We had to abandon our roots and our traditions and our culture and this and that to become American. And we just had to overcome so much hardship, right? We love talking about that. And as an Italian American from New York, I like to talk about that too on my social media. But see, the thing that really irks me is the amount of Italian Americans, especially those with incredible influence on here, who are choosing to stay silent about what's going on stateside right now, who are choosing to stay silent because either, number one, they're afraid of the repercussions, which means they're cowards, or number two, because they support it. They support all of the raids, they're supporting all of the detainments, all of the arrests, even of 5-year-olds. And the crazy thing about it is they still will talk about how Italian Americans were targeted for their accents. Italian Americans were targeted for their looks, right? Especially if they came from the South. And we all know that in the US, majority of Italians hailed from southern Italy, Sicily, Campania, Calabria, Puglia, Abruzzo, Molise, Basilicata. And instead of speaking out and speaking for their immigrant history, right? Their family history, okay? Because let's face it, if what was happening right now happened 100 years ago, their nonni would have been targeted. My nonni would have been targeted. Their accents, their inability to speak a fluent English, even our parents, even us. The only reason that I'm a US citizen is because I was born in the US, and they're trying to take away that right for Americans. So I do wonder what it is. Is it number one or is it number two? And in either case, if you still choose to remain silent about what's going on, you never cared about your country, you never cared about keeping it safe, because what's going on right now is a danger and a disgrace to every single American. Do better. E iniziate a parlarne, cazzo. Oh, Betty Joe. I'm not gonna insult you because by the looks of it, life has already. But what I will tell you is this. I am an Italian-American New Yorker, so yeah, I have heard of Ellis Island. I don't think you know about Ellis Island, though. The first immigrants arrived on Ellis Island in 1892. Many of them Italians, because remember, the first major wave of Italian migration to the United States happened between 1880 and 1920. We're gonna learn later why that 1920 date is very important. And if these new arrivals were sufficiently healthy and had all their papers in order, they had everything sorted, the inspection process from start to finish typically lasted from 3 to 5 hours, not days, not weeks, not years. Hours. They had to answer a series of questions, maybe their country of origin or where they were heading to in the US, what was their final destination. And despite the island's tough reputation, majority of the immigrants were seen, inspected, and sent on their way. Majority of these immigrants were treated with respect and dignity. Then, beginning in the early 1920s, arrivals to Ellis Island began to drop significantly, which meant fewer Italians. Do you know why, Betty Joe? Well, I'll tell you, it's because Americans like you weren't too fond of these newcomers to their country, right? These scary outsiders who did not talk or look or eat or pray like they did. Did you ever hear of the 1911 Dillingham Commission? It was an immigrant-focused, high-level commission funded by Congress to look into the causes and consequences of recent immigration because they wanted to restrict immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. They didn't want that many Italians, Armenians, and Poles coming to the US because, as I stated in the video, there were 0 laws barring these people from going to the US, settling there, and starting their new lives. I'm going to read this one because I don't want to mess this up. Drawing on eugenics beliefs in racial hierarchies and extensive studies, the Commission sought to scientifically prove that Eastern and Southern Europeans were not assimilating, which, by the way, was not true. They were assimilating, and that they degraded the quality of U.S. society and civilization. Sound familiar? So, with its 41 volumes of reports, the Commission laid the groundwork for the 1924 National Origins Act, aka the Immigration Act of 1924, aka the Johnson-Reed Act. And what did this law do? It set for the very first time permanent limitations on immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe and prevented immigration from Asia completely. The act also authorized the establishment of the U.S. Border Patrol. So prior to 1924, borders were pretty much open. So Betty Jo, do you now understand why I don't want to hear about your relatives or any relatives of Italian Americans for that matter who tell me that their family came legally or the right way? Do you understand why that argument makes absolutely no sense? And do you realize that the majority of immigrants arriving in the US have done so legally? And if you think otherwise, I'm afraid that no amount of data or historical facts can change your mind. As the saying goes, unless you were a Mohawk iron worker or an immigrant from Ireland, Italy, Germany, or Eastern Europe who arrived in the 19th or 20th century, no, you did not build New York. My Calabrese grandfather did, though, and although he's retired now, he was a bricklayer who helped build the city's infrastructure. And I don't know what happened where people like you, I'm assuming a younger person with at least a high school education, and I'm assuming you typed that comment on a smartphone. A person with a wealth of information literally at their fingertips. I don't know what happened where people like you differ so much in their intellectual, not to mention moral capacity, from a 92-year-old working blue-collar union man who never went to school, who rarely uses a cell phone. My mom and my aunts actually bought him a flip phone, but he rarely uses it. And my nonno was born in 1933, during the reign of another violent, tough-talking, rally-holding leader. And for him to have to watch the US meet the same fate that his beloved Italy and Calabria did, to have to see how quickly some Americans are willing to sacrifice their own rights just so the others could have less, to have to witness his own family members talk to him about these criminals entering our borders, as if their own people were not demonized by the white generational Americans a century ago, is a special kind of heartbreak. So my nonno paid his dues by building and being part of the multicultural, multi-ethnic mosaic that is New York City. And unlike the thousands of Italian Americans who, in the last 15 to 20 years, sold their businesses, sold their houses, and then started complaining that the neighborhoods changed, he's still there, in the city that he built. I'm honestly getting emotional reading all the comments, all of your stories about your immigrant families and your history, and how your great-grandparents or your grandparents had to avoid speaking their native languages, how they had to change their names. I mean, I know so many Italians, relatives, family, friends of family, who literally to this day still go by their American name and not their Italian name. I mean, there are so many Rosas, Rosa Marias, Rosarias, and they all go by Rose or Rosemary. Even Marias. How many Marias just go by Marie? And what you hear a lot is that our relatives were so proud to assimilate to being American, right? They would do anything to be American. But the sad truth is that they were shamed into being American. They were forced into becoming American. They didn't want to stop speaking their language. I mean, in a perfect world, they could have kept their language, passed it on to their children, and have their children be bilingual, bicultural. But in the United States, you have to choose, or at that time, and I guess now too, you had to choose. You're either American or you're not. Our Italian ancestors didn't teach us Italian or whatever language our relatives spoke because they didn't want their grandchildren and their children to be embarrassed, to be made fun of. It was a huge source of shame for these immigrants. And when I hear my fellow Italian Americans, really gloat about the fact that they assimilated and they worked hard, and there's no doubt that they worked hard, okay? They worked their asses off. My family did too. So many immigrants do, because immigrants are some of the hardest working people. But they had to give up a huge part of their identity in order to be accepted into American society. It didn't and it doesn't have to be an either or. It could be a both and. And a lot of people don't get that. So I've been making videos on Italian American culture and history for three and a half years now. And many Italian Americans tell me in the comments that they do not feel very connected to the culture. Either they never did or they just don't anymore. And the ones that did in the past usually did so because their grandparents or great-grandparents were still alive, so they still had that living link. Maybe they spoke Italian in the house or whatever language that was spoken in their family's hometown in Italy. Maybe they had Sunday dinner together. Maybe they cooked and ate certain foods. Maybe they celebrated certain holidays, went to church, believed in superstitions. But once those relatives passed, the link passed with them, and so did the language, the customs. And of course, this is a result of years and years of assimilation within the US, right? The Americanization of these Italian families, the discrimination, the demonization of being considered ethnic, and the fear of being othered. But I do believe that there is another type of Americanization at play here, and I would call it the anti-villagification. So there's the saying, right? It takes a village to raise a child. And I believe it stems from an African proverb, but I truly do think that in the US, the village is vilified. Modern US society does not value family and community and togetherness the same way that many other countries do. In the US, there's this pride of doing and having to go at things alone with your nuclear family. You don't want help, you don't ask for help. Your priority is your partner or your spouse, your kids, your pets, your money, your job, your car, your house, that's it. And this hyper-individualism, this self-centeredness, this shunning of shared experiences, in my opinion, all very American. When my mom and her family arrived in New York in 1971, they were always together. And I'm not just talking about her parents and her sisters. I'm talking all the grandparents, all the aunts, all the uncles, all the cousins. And they all lived with or near each other. They lived on Allerton Avenue in the Bronx. Many Italian Americans at that time did. I was born 20 years later in 1991, but I grew up like that too. I mean, my mom was a stay-at-home mom. My dad had his pizzeria, but when they were both out and couldn't stay with us at night, especially if it was a school night, my grandparents came over and watched us. Every holiday was spent together. Every anniversary, every graduation, every dance recital, every birthday. And then after the birthday party, we went over someone's house for coffee and cake and gifts. And this might be a little morbid. I don't know if other Italian families did this, but in our family, even after a funeral, we went out to eat at a restaurant all together. And we remained close even with my mom's aunts and uncles and cousins. So they were my great aunts and great uncles and second cousins, but we still remained pretty close. However, in adulthood, the anti-villagification has become more and more obvious. And listen, I get it. Life happens, okay? The kids of the family grow up and have their own kids, their own families, their own lives, and that's a beautiful thing. But I personally don't understand the distance that some people deliberately choose to take. I don't understand the little effort that people make in their relationships with their family. I don't understand moving away from your parents, your grandparents, especially if they're elderly, and not going to see them and visit them. I mean, even when I was still living in the US, I started to notice some patterns. I started to feel some things. Less get-togethers, more sorry we can't make it messages, even special occasions or important milestones in someone's life where you find out about it from a Facebook post or an Instagram story rather than a proper invitation or a text message or call. And I can't help but think about in 100 years when my grandparents are no longer around, what does our family look like? Will we even do the bare minimum anymore? Will we reach out to each other to say happy birthday or congrats on your new job or house or baby? And I know that this is a very common experience across ethnic groups in the United States when you move to the US or any country really after decades even after a century of assimilating, you adapt and you start to act like the people in that country. It just sucks though, and it makes me sad. What do you guys think?
Black people were not the only ones discriminated against in America. I know they'd like you to believe that they were, but they're not, right? I, as an Italian American, when Italians came over here, we were heavily discriminated against. We were shoved into ghettos. We weren't allowed to work certain jobs. We were looked down upon because of...
Okay, for my sanity, I have to believe that that video and many other videos by this creator are pure rage bait. But I do know that many in the Italian American community actually think that way, and they do constantly compare the experiences of Southern Italians in the United States with the experiences of Black Americans. And as a fellow Italian American, I find it appalling. Italians undoubtedly faced discrimination across the United States, some areas much worse than others. They were looked down upon, okay, because of their dark features, their dark Mediterranean features. A lot of them were poor, a lot of them were peasants. They didn't have an education. A lot of them did not speak English. Many of them didn't even learn the language at all. They were also practicing Catholics, but they also believed in folkloristic traditions like the malocchio, and that really scared the white Americans at the time. Many headed to the larger cities and found jobs in construction. According to an excerpt in Digital History by the University of Houston, about half of all late 19th century Italian immigrants were manual laborers, digging tunnels, putting down railroad tracks, building bridges and roads, and even the first skyscrapers. As early as 1890, 90% of New York City public works employees and 99% of Chicago street workers were Italian. You know what was happening in Black America in the 1890s? Despite great progress and achievements in the arts, medicine, and sports, Black people during that time were being actively segregated and disenfranchised under Jim Crow laws. And not just in the South. Yes, southern states enforced Jim Crow laws, but de facto segregation in the northern United States led to discriminatory housing and banking policies, keeping Black families out of certain neighborhoods and preventing many from owning homes, while exclusionary labor union practices resulted in Black workers being paid for less than white workers. And this person went on in her video basically telling Black Americans that they're the problem and that other ethnic groups figured it out, and Black Americans are basically standing in the way of themselves. She even talked about generational wealth, and I think anyone with 2 eyes, a brain, and some common sense knows that building wealth takes time. If a group, any group, begins at a severe disadvantage, it is extremely difficult for them to catch up. Today, housing wealth comprises 2/3 of Black wealth portfolios. However, according to the research of Princeton University economist Elora Dererencourt and her peers, Black Americans often have less access to solid retirement plans and earn lower returns on investments, including from home ownership. These gaps are rooted in a history of discrimination that kept Black families out of better work, housing, and financial opportunities. Over time, this has led to today's racial wealth gap because, again, starting with less money makes it much harder to build more, especially since the Jim Crow era only officially ended with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a time when Italians were pretty much integrated into American life, and when, according to a 2016 essay by Fred Gardaff, Italian Americans were surpassing the national average income. Sure, negative stereotypes did harm the overall image of Italian Americans back then, and honestly even today. And it actually repulses me to see just how many prominent Italian American voices on here continue to perpetuate the stereotype of the violent mafioso, or the gold chain wearing womanizer, or the stunad who can't string 2 coherent words together. Yet despite all that, we were never considered a white man's property. In fact, we were absorbed into whiteness. So over time, we were able to access a plethora of opportunities. We were able to create businesses, build and pass on our wealth, investing that wealth in a number of ways. I mean, the Bank of America, whose original name is Bank of Italy, was founded in 1904 in San Francisco by an Italian American. He aimed to assist the local working class people in that area who were mostly Italian Americans. And although Italians have had to reckon with the racializing of our own ethnic identity in the United States, although there were Italian Americans fighting the good fight back then, again, people like Vito Marcantonio, U.S. congressman from East Harlem who championed the rights of workers, immigrants, and minority communities, especially African Americans, Italian Americans, and Puerto Ricans. People like Father James Groppi, son of 2 Italian immigrants and a Milwaukee Catholic priest who led many protests for racial justice, even marching with Martin Luther King Jr., and was frequently arrested for his activism. And although there are so many Italian Americans today who continue to fight for the same causes, we unfortunately, especially those of us from the Northeast, cannot shake the long-standing reputation of us being extremely racist and ignorant of our own circumstances, as obviously seen by this person's account and the massive support in our community for this despicable administration. Hi Deb, Italian American to Italian American. Do you realize that most immigrants who enter the US are doing so legally? Do you realize that ICE is going after and detaining immigrants who are coming in properly? Do you realize that this is exactly how the white Americans used to talk about Italians, specifically Southern Italians, and I see that you're Napoletana. Non te ne accorgi, o forse non lo sai nemmeno, che i bianchi americani all'epoca parlavano in questo modo degli italiani, dei meridionali, che eravamo tutti criminali, eravamo tutti mafiosi. So I think you're missing the point, actually. Ciao. No, Carol, I will not shut up. I will never shut up about the hypocrisy of the Italian American community and the fact that they worked their asses off. It's not a uniquely Italian thing. I know that Italian immigrants worked their asses off. My parents are both Italian immigrants. My grandparents in the United States, they worked their asses off too, okay? So don't talk to me about Italians working their asses off because I'm a product of that. However, when you use it to diminish the accomplishments and work ethic and humanity of other immigrant groups, that's when you seem to lose the plot. All immigrants work their asses off, okay? Immigrants are the hardest working groups of people. The argument is not whether Italians are hard workers or not. It's the fact that this administration and many far-right administrations like it use the scapegoat of immigrants to hide and distract people like you from the actual issues, okay? So other countries enjoy universal healthcare, not free healthcare, universal healthcare, accessible healthcare, universal and accessible education, okay? Safety nets, social welfare, okay? Welfare in other countries outside of the United States is not a bad word. It's not a dirty word. And these countries, mind you, have a GDP that is much less than that of the United States. The people in those countries earn much less than people in the United States do. And these tactics are not new. Okay, blaming a country's problems on a certain group of people is not new. History repeats itself always. So you call me a disgrace, but I think you're a disgrace. I think your president's a disgrace. I think it's a disgrace that Italian Americans, not all of us, but many of you, vote for a convicted felon and then talk about how today's immigrants are bringing crime to the United States. Please.
So there is this New York Times opinion piece about how Italians became white, or whatever the case, whatever you might want to call it. It's very surface level, but it does touch on a lot of really interesting points in regards to Italians coming here in the 1800s, facing discrimination, not being able to find work. It talks about how there were Italian communities that kind of like not joined forces, but they, cooperated and lived together with like Black communities. It talks about how Italians used to be lynched in Louisiana, and even goes in to talk about how Italians were used for cheap labor after the end of slavery. It also talks about Christopher Columbus Day and how Italians leveraged that in order to gain this status of being white in America. Ultimately, I think it's really important to dive into the history of all racial groups in America. We're a really diverse country, and like I feel like people should be proud to honor their histories. However, whiteness and acceptance into American culture is something that Italian Americans did fight for and they did gain. But as you can see here with this comment, like there are some Italian Americans, there's Portuguese Americans and Spanish Americans who quite literally, you know, fit the standard of being white, being from Europe, right? But in physical appearance cannot find themselves able to conform to whiteness.
Because on this continent, it's your civic duty to mistreat a marginalized group.
And that's the quick answer to the question of how Italian immigrants ended up becoming considered white in the United States of America. And that's essentially also the answer to how every other immigrant group essentially became white as well in the United States of America. They all got a little bit of economic success. They became political leaders, councilmen, aldermen, mayors, state representatives, congressmen, eventually senators. Instead of being looked at as the criminals, they became the police officers. And the history of policing in America has so much to do with white supremacy and oppressing marginalized people. Assimilation via oppression. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And how good does it make the white supremacists look when you've got marginalized people continuing white supremacy?
When you talk about the vice lords and all these gangs that really started, you know, if they go back and they read their original charters, right? The original charters were set up, they were supposed to be community
protecting the neighborhood.
Based. Yeah, and they was protecting the neighborhood, and they was protecting the neighborhood from the police.
Yeah.
Right? Because there was a lot of police brutality. And we were fighting not to be colorized. We were fighting not to be put in an apartheid colorized system. And when you go back and you look, and it, you know, those signs what they was wearing in Memphis said, I am a man. You know, we were fighting not to be dehumanized and taken out of all humanity, right? We wanted to be and remain human. But now we've accepted and we've adopted this colorized system. But those were the teachings that were taught on the west side of Chicago. So that's where I come from. That's what's ingrained in me. That's what I carry. That's what I still fight for today. You know, there's no pure anything. We're all living on a hyphen, right? You know, you're Italian American, and I'm gonna say this, right? When we were growing up, we grew up with Italians, we grew up with Greeks, we grew up with Polish, we grew up with Irish, right? And they were proud to call themselves Greek, Italian, Irish, right? When did everybody become white?
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They don't say I'm Greek anymore. They don't say I'm Italian anymore. They don't say, you know, I'm Jewish. Everybody, it's either white, black, green, purple, blue, or orange.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a
People of
conversation
color.
about that.
Mm-hmm.
'Cause
Right.
my mom, I used to, you know, what are you? I'm black and white. And my mom's like, no, you're Italian.
You're
Like,
Italian.
you're Italian. You're not white.
Claim
you're
it.
Italian, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And by the way, the Italians, you know, come from the Moors, right? You know,
Yep.
so, you know, when you all of us are human beings,
First and
right?
foremost, right?
And if we can get back to being human beings,
Yes.
and get away from this colorized apartheid system that we're operating in, then we got a chance to make it. You know, and that's what the fight has always been about in this country, right? Those who have been classified as black have always been trying to get out of black status. So when immigrants come in, they quickly say, what's your status? And they tell you what their status is, right? And, you know, so nationality, birthright, citizenship, status, those are the things that we need to be talking about. That was the conversation on the West Side, and that's the conversation I still carry.
And you wonder why you never hear talk of the Moors. You never hear them say in history when you're going to high school in the American educational system, they don't teach you that black people ruled the world for 800 years as Moors in Asia, Spain, Portugal, North, South America. I mean, the entire globe. They advanced the cultural civilization of humanity. This is never taught to so-called black people in America, only that they were slaves. Everything they are taught is to denigrate the imagery and the cultural moral fiber of the people. But black people ruled the world under the title is Moors for 800 years and 2,000 years before that. And they are also the educators and the founding fathers of all advanced cultural technology and understanding. And they are actually responsible for educating the so-called Europeans we see in modern times, the white man. And this is the history that's been left out.
The Moors went into Europe. They changed the appearance of the population. Do you see? So you have Italians, Spaniards being darker than the Scandinavians. A Scandinavian person told me that they never considered the Italians or Jewish people to be white. Do you see? Because the lighter people are further north.
Laugh if you want to. You know, your hair is kinkier than mine. What does that mean? And you know what they say about dark Italians?
You see, Sicilians have black blood pumping through their hearts. And no, if you don't believe me, you can look it up. Hundreds and hundreds of years ago, you see, the Moors conquered Sicily. And the Moors are niggers. See, way back then, Sicilians were like WAPs from northern Italy. They all had blonde hair and blue eyes. But, well, then the Moors moved in there and, well, they changed the whole country. They did.
Let me tell you, they lied to you, starting with the Christopher Columbus story, and we're going to get right into it. You're looking at Charles V. His bloodline grandparents are the ones who financed Christopher Columbus, Ferdinand and Isabella. And you see how he looks. He looks like us, okay? That alone should let you know that something is off about the story they told you. Now, notice what they called his empire. That's the title. The empire on which the sun never sets. This was the Habsburg monarchy and the Holy Roman Empire. It was vast. At any given point time, the sun was up somewhere because he was global. This was global. These are his children, bloodline children, Philip II of Spain and Maria of Austria. They want your mind to stay stuck, your history to start in the 1600s. Now, this will be part number 8 of the Black Nobility of Europe series. And let's just get into it. Now, their control was basically global, but we're just going to focus on Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and Italy. Because when I say those regions, I know the type of people that comes to your mind. Now, you can pause the screen if you want to read that snippet at the top. But let me ask you this. Why would a well-known German sculptor in the 1600s, why would he make expensive marble statues like this depicting people who look like this? And a lot of his work was in Italy. This is his name, Melchior Barthel, in the 1600s. Very interesting. Well, let's see how the Italians and the Germans look. Now, this is a very important part. I hope you don't skip through this part. Benjamin Franklin, he wrote an essay in 1751, and they published the book in 1755. We'll be reading from page number 10. The title is at the top, okay? Let's see what Benjamin Franklin had to say. We're going to start reading in the red box. It says, which leads me to add one remark, that the number of purely Y and T people in the world is proportionately very small. Interesting. He's saying they were the minority. Isn't it funny that they call us the minority now? Let's continue. He says, all Africa is black or tawny. Asia, chiefly tawny. Listen to this. America, exclusive of the newcomers, wholly so. He's letting you know the whole America was BLK or tawny, just trying to avoid the algorithm. Now you know how the indigenous American Indians look. But let's continue. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also. Interesting. He called the Italians and Germans swarthy. Interesting. Now, they try to play games with the word swarthy. Now, he wrote that in the 1700s. This is how you beat that. This dictionary was written in the 1700s around the same time. So this is a contemporary dictionary. That way we'll know the intent of the word swarthy when it was used. Okay. Again, this is Samuel Johnson's dictionary. Now at the bottom, I'll zoom in a little bit. At the bottom is the original snippet from the actual dictionary. And at the top is just the digital version of it. I have them both underlined. But let's read. It says, swarthy, dark of complexion, black, dusky, tawny. Okay. But notice the example that they give. The swarthy Africans complain. Okay. So you know what swarthy means. They even said the swarthy Africans. Okay. And notice tawny is in there too. So now you know what the indigenous American Indians look like. Okay. Now, this tapestry was done in Germany in the 1400s. It's called Wild Men and Moors. Okay. They're defending their castle. Notice their complexion. This is the nobility. They're defending their castle with the bows and arrows. Notice their complexion. They're defending their castle against these people. Notice their complexion. Interesting. Okay. Again, that's in Germany. That was done in Germany in the 1400s. Okay. Now, this picture, if you watch part 7, they found this statue. Well, this statue was made in Switzerland, of all places, in the 1600s. And he has the coat of arms with the double-headed black eagle, which is associated with the Habsburg and Holy Roman Empire. Okay, now you're starting to get a little context. You're starting to see. So the tapestry that I showed you, that's from Germany. This is Charles V bloodline daughter, Maria of Austria. This was the German sculptor. Now this was made in Italy. A lot of his work was in Italy. I just wanted you to see this picture so you'll know this is how Germany used to look. You know, this is how Germany used to look. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, okay? This is the tip of the iceberg. I'm going to do way more videos about these people because it's so vast, okay? All right? Y'all be blessed.
I suppose there's a price to pay for every degree.